Hi, I'm Mr. eTutor, your mystery tutor here at mysterytutor.com, and welcome to video module 2-2. In this module, I'd like to explain to you how the SAT is actually scored. As I mentioned in the earlier video in this series, the SAT scoring system is very different from the scoring system you would see on a high school test. Remember, the entire point of the SAT is not to compare you to an objective standard, but rather to rank you among everyone who takes the SAT. As I've said before, and as I will say again many times, the SAT is about performance, not about knowledge. In order to maintain its standardization without using exactly the same questions every single time, the College Board has come up with a two-stage scoring system that allows it to correct for any slight inconsistencies from one test to another. Now, on the board behind me, I've laid out the two-stage scoring system used by the College Board. Let's take a look at it. I will try to walk you through the two stages from your perspective as an individual test taker. On test day, you'll see three major sections of the test: the writing section, the math section, and the critical reading section. The College Board will use your performance on each section on test day to determine your raw score, and your raw score is calculated like this. Every time you answer a question correctly, you will gain 1 raw point. Every time you answer a question incorrectly, you will lose 1/4 of a raw point. And every time you leave a multiple choice question blank, you will neither gain nor lose a raw point. The exception to this is the math section's grid-in questions. On those questions, you will not lose any points for incorrect answers. The first stage in the College Board's two-stage process is to calculate your raw score for each section of the test. For the sake of this discussion, let's imagine that you made a 45 raw score in the writing section, a 50 raw score on the math section, and a 63 raw score on the reading comprehension section. The College Board's ultimate goal is to take your raw score on each section and compare it to the raw scores on each section for every other SAT taker on the same day that you took the test. The College Board is essentially curving your SAT score so that all of the SAT scores for all students for each section will create a bell curve, as you see over here on the right-hand side of the screen. To create this bell curve for each individual section, we plot the section score on the x-axis running from 200 to 800 and the number of students on the vertical axis. As you can see, the College Board wants a distribution where most students fall roughly in the 500-point range for each section. Now, this is the most critical thing for you to understand when it comes to how the SAT is scored. On one particular day, your raw score of 45 on the writing section might equate to a 570 final score. However, on another day, it might be as high as a 690. The actual final conversion, again, will be determined by comparing your raw score to all the other raw scores from students who took the test on that day. In other words, if more students tend to do better on the writing section on that particular day, then your raw score will translate to a lower final score. But if students don't do as well, the same raw score could translate to a higher final score. It could also translate to any score in between the two. Your hypothetical math score of 50 raw points might translate to a scaled score of 690 to 770 points. Again, what determines the final conversion is the average performance of all other test takers. Finally, your hypothetical critical reading score of 63 could get you a final score anywhere from 700 to 800. Now, the key thing to take away from all of this is that it's impossible to determine exactly what your scaled score will be based solely on the questions that you answer right or wrong. In order to figure out what your final scaled score will be, the College Board must know what everyone else's raw score was in addition to your own raw score. Make sure you understand this. It's possible on two different test days to have exactly the same raw score and receive completely different scaled scores on a given section. Now, while we're on the subject of how the SAT goes from your raw score to your scaled score, let's debunk a very popular SAT strategy myth right here. A lot of people are pretty surprised to determine that part of your SAT score relies on what other people do on the SAT on the same day that you take it. So, in an effort to exploit this fact, they advise you to try to take the SAT on the day when most people are likely to do poorly on the test. The theory is that if everyone is more likely to do bad, then the same performance by you should result in a higher score. But there are two major problems with this strategy. In the first place, in a practical sense, it's just about impossible to be able to predict when most people on the test are likely to do poorly. Secondly, and most importantly, you should know that I simplified this discussion just a little bit so that I wouldn't have to clutter your mind with inconsequential details. But I left out one detail of the College Board's norming process. Technically, it's not exactly true that they're only comparing your score to the scores of everyone else who took the test when you did. They also compare your score to a historical sample of previous test takers. This historical comparison undoes any irregularity from one testing population to another. This two-stage scoring process also has a very serious implication for your score. The two-stage scoring system makes it impossible to know in advance exactly how many points any particular question will be worth. To see what I mean, let's briefly go back to our hypothetical examples on the board. As we said previously, a raw score of 45 on the writing section might get you a final score of 570 points on a particular day. However, on the same day, depending upon how the scaling goes, a raw score of 46 might also get you a final score of 570 points. Alternatively, a raw score of 46 might get you a final score of 600 points. So you see, the difference of one question, that is one raw point, can end up having an impact anywhere from 0 points to 30 points on your final score for a particular section. Just to reiterate, there's no way to know when you're actually taking the test how much any particular question will impact your score. It all depends on everyone's final performance, which cannot be determined until you finish the section. I thought it was important to explain exactly how the SAT is scored, because scoring is an important part of any test-taking process. But the most important part of what we've discussed today is that any particular question might impact your score by as many as 30 points or as few as 0 points. And there's no way to tell at the moment that you're actually taking the test which will be the case. Now, I need to make one final distinction before we move on to the next video. When I say that an individual question might impact your score by as few as 0 points or as many as 30 points, I don't mean that the individual numbered questions are worth a different amount of raw points. I simply mean that the 45th question you answer on a particular question might impact your score more or less than the 46th point or the 47th point. Whether you get those points by answering number 17 incorrectly and number 19 correctly, or by answering number 17 correctly and number 19 incorrectly, is irrelevant. Which particular questions on the test you answer correctly or incorrectly are irrelevant to your final score. All that matters is how many were answered correctly and how many were answered incorrectly. So, that's pretty much it for scoring on the SAT. As you can see, it's a little bit more complex than scoring for your average high school test. Thanks for watching, enjoy the other videos, and remember, if you know the rules, it's easier than you think.